Andrea Devine, thank you so much for joining me on Alumless Takes. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here, Ryan.
Awesome. Well, you and I have had the chance to get to know each other a little bit over the last few years, and I've kind of watched with interest because I worked there at the University of Virginia in the Office of Engagement, but your role at the time did not exist. Your role as Senior Director for Volunteer Engagement, which is an amazing role, knowing what I know about UVA and the Office of Engagement. So I guess I wanted to start off our conversation by asking you a little bit about your role and how it's evolved over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. So, the role is new. It's only been around for 2.5. I'm the only person who's ever filled the role. And when it was created, the idea was that we would have someone who would think comprehensively and holistically about volunteer engagement at the university. As you know, but the listeners don't, University of Virginia is very decentralized, so much so that we have almost a foundation for every school and unit, which means that there is a board for every foundation that belongs to a school and unit. And so this role, the idea for it was to see if we can create something, better communications, programs, activities that would make our volunteers feel like they're part of the greater university. So when I started in the role, there wasn't a whole lot of direction. And I will say that even after 2.5 years, there's been some fits and starts, and it still feels like a startup. And, in order to get my colleagues to come along, it's about building a lot of trust, consistent communication, being socializing ideas and getting buy-in. And so we've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I remember my role was digital engagement strategy, and I definitely remember the dynamics that you described, right? Which was trying to get everybody on board, and really, it's a very complicated place, right? Where there's lots of volunteerism happening all over the institution. I recall at the time, like working to assemble something of a centralized listing of volunteer opportunities and the challenges that went into that. So, I mean, volunteerism is happening all over the University of Virginia. You were just mentioning board based volunteerism. How have you attempted to understand the big picture there, along with sort of the nuances that exist with the colleges, schools, and units, and not to mention advancement, right? There's and the Alumni Association, right? These entities, all of which have volunteer engagement happening.
Yes. So when I started in the role, the first thing I did was an audit. And I met with representatives from every school and unit, over 40 meetings over one summer, and just asked, what does volunteering look like in your shop? I wanted to get a big sense of, 10,000-foot overview, if you will, of what the landscape looked like. And from there, I learned that we have over 4,000 volunteers at UVA. They serve in 15 different capacities. A lot of the buckets that I used were based on the case alumni insight. So that provided some direction and guidance on how we should be thinking about volunteerism. One of the things I've learned too over the last 2.5 years is that our single degree holders in the professional schools don't always think of themselves as university volunteers, right? So they maybe are a single degree for the law school, single degree at the business school at Darden, single degree at School of Medicine. And so creating communications and programs that are holistic around the university might not work for them. And so that's a nuance and something that I'll be continuing to work with my colleagues in those schools to see if there's ways that we can make them feel a little bit more connected to grounds, central grounds, as you know, we call it here at UVA, not
Grounds,
campus
yes, not
grounds.
campus.
And then I think a number of our constituents too, that internally we count them as volunteers, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as volunteers. And I would say that that's mostly in our career services area. So alumni who work for a company, who come back for a career fair and are talking to students, we count them as volunteers, but they might not see themselves as volunteers. And maybe they're only engaged because they come to that career fair and they're talking to our students. And we're counting them as alumni, as volunteers because they're alumni and they're doing a service to our students. But trying to think of how we would communicate with them to make them feel as if they are part of the larger volunteer community is also something that we're trying to work through. So those are some of the nuances. Those are the things that we've discovered. And then trying to build a program around it as a team of one, myself, but as Cindy Frederick, as you know, our senior associate vice president for the Office of Engagement, tells me, you may be an individual contributor, but you are a convener of many.
That sounds very much like Cindy. I was just sort of thinking about the audit that you were doing, and I think you mentioned like 15 different methods or avenues of volunteerism, which is amazing. Was there any that sort of jumped out in your mind at that time as far as like, wow, like that's actually happening here?
I think board service is most by far the most common here at UVA because of our unique organizational structure with the number of foundations that we have. And then the next bigger groups that follow that would be our alumni club volunteers and leadership, reunion giving and reunion outreach, and then our parents council. So those are the largest number of volunteers. Aside from those career services folks, those career services volunteers that don't necessarily think they're volunteers, there is a large number of those people as well. So I don't know if that was necessarily eye-opening. It was just really good knowledge to have as we start to think about building out the program.
As you said, like the career volunteer attending a career fair, right? Representing your company, right? Or maybe your small business, not necessarily thinking about it as volunteerism in the conventional sense, right? But it really is, right? Because people definitely have options, right? As where they're going to recruit and to spend the time there and help make connections with students is amazing. So I think that recognizing volunteers has been a key part of we are treating the recognition of those volunteers in a similar way that we think about donor recognition, right? And tell me a little bit about what you've learned about the ways in which volunteers like to be recognized at UVA, or maybe how they don't, I guess, right? How maybe something you've discovered that does not necessarily work when it comes to volunteer recognition.
Yeah, going back to the audit, I interviewed a number of volunteers as well. So, not just my internal colleagues to find out what the landscape looked like here, but I interviewed a number of volunteers as well to say, like, what is your motivation for giving back in this way? What inspires you to continue to volunteer in this activity or this activity or this program? And what I found is that the younger volunteers really want the acknowledgement from leadership. They want to know that the time and the effort and the energy that they're putting in is worthwhile, and they want recognition from leadership. So talking to young alumni councils, especially, they want the deans to acknowledge that they're putting in the time, that they're putting in the hours. Thinking about young alumni who are either starting a new career or starting a young family, time is money for them. And so they're thinking, I can't necessarily make a major gift, but I can contribute in this way. And they really want that acknowledgement from leadership. Talking to our older, more experienced volunteers, they don't necessarily want the acknowledgement from leadership. They don't necessarily need the letter from the president or the dean. What they want to know is that they are making a real impact on either curriculum, budget, or other things that are really impacting the university. And so they're getting that feedback by attending board meetings and seeing that their contributions are really moving the needle. They're getting that feedback from students who are saying, wow, I'm so glad you came and talked to our class. I've learned so much. Can you please put me in contact or connection with maybe a colleague or someone else that you work with? Please tell me more about your career trajectory. And so that's been really interesting to think about how we acknowledge those two demographics when it comes to age or time away from the university. I would say too that the volunteers who are more on the front lines, so our reunion giving volunteers, our club leader volunteers, they want to just be in the know. They want to have access. They're not board volunteers that are going to board meetings and have access to deans and the provost and the president. They don't have that access. So how can we keep them connected to the university and the bigger things that are going on as they continue to be on the front lines and be really wonderful advocates for us?
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing, right? How it's so nuanced when you think about how, depending on where someone is in their life stage, right, their methods and type of recognition can be different, and so too based on the role that they're playing in support of the university. I know one of the areas that you've been thinking a lot about is metrics and measurement, of course, right? Because I think part of the role correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but I imagine part of the role is to sort of synthesize and report on volunteer engagement across the university. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned, maybe what some advice you might have for other volunteer engagement leaders like yourself who are attempting to quantify, measure, report on volunteer engagement at their schools.
Yeah, again, back to this audit, Ryan. I learned so much. And I think it was not only the audit, but the annual CASE Alumni Engagement Metrics Survey. I think it's now called CASE Alumni Insights, or at least the report that they put out is. And I had the opportunity for the first time to really look at that data, and I was like, none of this makes sense. And so we were submitting data to CASE, and I love that every year they put in like the confidence level of how confident are you in this data that it's actually accurate or whatnot. Because I was like, this is pretty low. I would not feel comfortable submitting this. But what's been interesting is finding out and talking to my colleagues in all of the schools and units is that everyone was putting in their data into our CRM the way that they needed to pull it out. And it was working for them. Now we have someone, myself, who's coming in and taking a holistic view of our data. And I'm realizing that it's not in there. There's no standardization of how we're putting it in. Luckily, we are in the middle of a CRM transition. So we are moving from Advance to Salesforce Ascend. And this is the perfect opportunity to really start to think about policies of standardization on how we enter our data. Right now, there's so many options for how you code a volunteer that some get used and some don't. And I'm like, there's 8 different opportunities to code this volunteer data. We only probably need 3. And, we have a start date and a stop date, and sometimes those are being used and sometimes they're not. Is the volunteer still active? Are they off the board? It's that sort of thing that we need to have accurate data in our CRM if we are going to have any sort of success in growing the program, in seeing what our volunteers are interested in doing, why they continue to come back to the university, and just have again that 10,000-foot overview of what we're looking at for our volunteer landscape. So I would say for those out there who are maybe not going through a CRM transition or are pulling their case data and submitting it in a way that like, oh, we've always done it this way, take a look at what you're pulling out and start to look at the inconsistencies. What I ended up doing is I ended up pulling all the data and sending it to the schools and units and like, tell me what's correct, what's accurate. We need to clean this up. So it's been a 2.5-year process to get our data clean, but I'm really happy that we are so close and we're making that CRM transition in February, and that will just make our reporting so much smoother.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine to your point, right, there's a whole consistency of nomenclature, of taxonomy, of categorization. Step one, right? Then sort of step two is as you described, which is are we using the volunteer modules, right? My colleague Melissa Shipke talks about you could actually just put volunteer insights as an event, right? Those also have start and end dates, and sometimes that even makes it easier to extract it again. But being consistent, as you say, right, is kind of the key. And to your original thought, I mean, getting that buy-in on how to put data in and so you can get it out is key to making sure that the program advances and you can share the results across the school. But tell me about communication with volunteers. I know you mentioned that key to success and recognition is information, right? What have you discovered about?
Yeah, so we're trying a couple of new things. You had mentioned that in your past life here at UEA that you had worked on maybe a website that had listed all of the volunteer opportunities. I think nobody was paying attention to it anymore, Ryan. So when I got here, I'm
What's that
looking
left?
at like, there's like, here, contact this person for this opportunity. Well, that person doesn't work here anymore. So we ended up taking the website down and thinking, I'm going to spend some more time thinking about what it should look like and how we should list our opportunities. And at first we wanted it to be this menu option, right? It was like, people come onto our website, put in the school that you went to, when did you graduate, how many hours, can you serve, and what are you most interested in doing? And it would pop up this menu of options. But that was too cumbersome. And again, one person shop here. what can we do and put this online so that it tells the story of the broad volunteer landscape that we have at UVA and provides opportunities for people to just get a snapshot of what all is available and what is offered. And so that's what we ended up doing. And so right now in phase one, I like to say, is that it's really just telling the story. So this new website just tells the story. Of course, there's ways that you can go on there and you can find, oh, I want to, volunteer for reunions. Well, here's the link to, here's information on volunteering for reunions. Here's some information about how much time it's going to take. And if you're interested, contact this person. So it was collecting all that information from all the schools and units and putting it on a central website. You can still find that information by going to the business school or going to the School of Medicine's Alumni Association and finding that information. But this is a central repository for that. The other thing we're trying is a new webinar series called Leader to Leader: Insights from UVA Leadership. And again, this is an opportunity to provide access to all volunteers. Most commonly, the people that join are those frontline volunteers that don't have access, so less of the board members who are at the highest level and have daily interactions with the dean or weekly interactions with UVA leadership, and providing opportunities for those volunteers to hear from our leadership. So we have done 4 so far. We're doing 2 in the spring semester and 2 in the fall. And I've had some fun just this week pulling all of our data and seeing how far we've come and where should I massage things for next year. And I think that what we've seen is that, again, consistency. We're keeping the day of the week the same, the time the same. A lot of our alumni are along the East Coast, of course. So we're trying to pick a time that really matches with the majority of our volunteers and where they live. We are getting, with the hot topics that we've had a deputy athletic director talk about the changing landscape in college athletics. We've had the dean of students talk about honor and student life today. And I think that's really important for our volunteers, again, as they are advocates for our university. They talk to their friends, they talk to their fellow alumni, and keep them informed. So not only does that provide access to those frontline volunteers so that they have more knowledge about what's going on, but it also makes them engaged and educated so that they can share this information with their fellow alumni.
And it gives them that elevated experience, right? That others aren't getting per se, that they feel included and special, and that their work is being appreciated, not just in and of itself, but they get additional inside view and content that's just for them. So I think that that's an excellent way to engage volunteers outside of the volunteerism itself. So always my last question, Andrea, tell me about a book or a movie or a show, recipe, podcast that you are listening to or watching and that you would recommend.
You mean aside from Alumless?
Aside from Alumless Takes. Thank you for that.
No, I will say that Alumless is great because I come to it often to get inspiration, get new ideas. And one of the things I love about my job is I have the opportunity to benchmark with other institutions and find out what they're doing. So aside from Alumless, I will say that anything that Adam Grant puts out, the organizational psychologist, he did this wonderful interview recently with Brene Brown to promote her new book. And they were very critical about the traditional thoughts on leadership that a lot of us fall into. My mind was blown. And at the same time, I was like screaming in my car, listening to the podcast. I'm like, yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. So I would say anything by Adam Grant is my go-to.
Yeah, he's a great follow on LinkedIn too. I thoroughly enjoy Adam Grant, bunch of great books, and Brene Brown too. Excellent. Andrea Devine, thank you so much, Senior Director for Volunteer Engagement in the Office of Engagement at UVA. Really grateful for you and the kind words, all the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Ryan. It's been great to talk to you.